It's a big scandal tonight. What drug companies are not telling you about antidepressants that they're selling to millions and millions of Americans.
"15 years ago, I warned the FDA and I warned the country in toxic psychiatry that antidepressants were causing a stimulant amphetamine-like syndrome that was resulting in violence and murder."
Although the FDA has known about this side effect since 1990, it has never insisted that a pharmaceutical company study the phenomenon with sensitive measures of treatment-emergent suicidality.
In 1994, in talking back to Prozac, I warned the country and the FDA again, this time with tons now of scientific data on the same issues.
But this is the most interesting slide. This you won't have seen, perhaps. This is data from 3.5 years ago. This is data from FDA that FDA put in the public domain. This shows you a clearly statistically significant increased risk of suicide.
The company hid suicidal data. When it would get an incoming suicide from the field, it would reclassify it as depression. It would reclassify it as no drug effect.
The powerful evidence of antidepressant-induced suicidality occurring in patients under 25 years old and 45 to 64 years old mandates a warning for all age groups.
Claude Boucher, who was in Germany working for Eli Lilly, wrote an ashamed memo to the central office saying, "How would I explain this to, quote, my family, to, quote, a judge?" But he said we would, of course, go along with what the company said.
Think how many lives could have been saved if the FDA warned about this side effect back in 1991 when it first evaluated the issue and swept it under the carpet. Think how many families and communities have been devastated by this side effect in those 15 years.
A giant drug maker who authorities say broke the law by bribing doctors across this country with Hawaiian vacations, tickets to Madonna. And why? They wanted those doctors to sell your family their drugs, and many did.
They also, in America, are able to throw money at the American Psychiatric Association, throw money at the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, throw money at psychiatric departments and universities, and almost every way that the general public and doctors hear about drugs, get information about these drugs, is really, if you follow the money trail, not that far you have to follow it. It all comes from drug companies.
I don't think we should drug our children when we need to educate them, discipline them, love them, and raise them.
You know, when I was starting out in practice 25 years ago, you would never see a little kid on these psychiatric drugs. I mean, the idea of pediatric bipolar disorder was unheard of. It was, you know, the idea of labeling a 3- and 4-year-old with a bipolar disorder just seemed ridiculous.
The growing brain should not be bathed in toxic substances. Ritalin stunts, all the stimulants stunt growth, cause obsessive behaviors, suppress the spontaneity of the child. Many of these children get very depressed on these drugs.
Poor judgment, impulsivity, agitation, sometimes even delusions, hallucinations. When these kids go off of these drugs, which they do because they're kids, they'll withdraw off of them. You'll have these extreme kind of what the antidepressant discontinuation syndrome, which is just a withdrawal response that can make a kid have akathisia, which makes you feel like you're coming out of your skin.
If you look at another diagnosis that now has become very common in children, pediatric bipolar disease, you see that in 1994, pediatric bipolar disease was virtually unheard of. And between 1994 and around 2004, the diagnosis just went up exponentially. What changed? Kids didn't change. What changed is expensive drugs became available that could be marketed off-label, illegally, to children so that doctors would be diagnosing kids as having pediatric bipolar disease or ADHD.
This whole idea of kids being labeled younger and younger with these kinds of conditions that are just kind of normal. Kids who are 3 and 4 years old who are just not paying attention because they're 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds being labeled with ADHD and be given these speed amphetamine type of drugs. This is all very new stuff in the last 10, 15 years, and it's terrifying. And of course, it's all driven by drug company profits.
A blockbuster study in the New England Journal of Medicine confirms the effectiveness of antidepressants has been overhyped. In fact, the study, reported on today in the Wall Street Journal, goes even further, claiming pharmaceutical companies exaggerated the effectiveness of 12 popular antidepressants by publishing the results of positive clinical trials while suppressing the results of negative clinical trials.
If you think of alcohol, people who are drinking often think they're the life of the party when they're the death of the party. And again, thinking of alcohol, people will get out of control, disinhibited, and become violent. But if they never drink again, they won't be violent ever again. All psychoactive substances, all substances that affect our brain functions, spellbind us. And I call it medication spellbinding in medication madness because it's about the drugs we're prescribed.
It's this paradox in the long-term outcomes where you get the opposite of what you think you're going to get. So antidepressants become depressogenic, anti-anxiety drugs actually increase anxiety long-term, and probably the most surprising thing, and there's a real strong story in the literature that documents this, is antipsychotics actually change the brain in ways that make people more chronically psychotic over the long term. And that is a story that seems so totally contrary to everything we believe and know to be true. And it's certainly when I started this whole research, I was absolutely convinced of the other story. You know, that antipsychotics were very effective, they were absolutely essential. And then there's this other story that stretches across 30, 40 years where they say, uh-oh, it looks like we're making the brain more biologically prone to psychosis.
When you take a psychotropic drug of any kind, whether it's Prozac or cocaine, all these psychotropic drug means that a drug that affects one's neurotransmitter, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. And for many people who take these, you get the sense of being disinhibited, which means that you just do things that you would never ordinarily do, okay, which often happens when people use alcohol. It's just one of those things that happen when you're not on these kind of psychotropic drugs. Things pass through your mind that you never act on. You're not impulsive. You don't do anything about. But when you're on these kinds of drugs, you're much more likely to act on thoughts you would never act on.
Well, first of all, we have to understand how serotonin reuptake inhibitors work. When the brain secretes serotonin, it immediately sucks that serotonin back up again. So the serotonin will get released, and then it will get uptaken, reuptaken. It'll get sucked up back up again into the nerves so that it doesn't have too much of an effect. This is called reuptake, and it's a standard process that occurs in the body. So you get off your serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and because this uptake mechanism has been shut down, now you got all of this serotonin reuptake, all of the serotonin that has left the nerve cells. You run into a major risk of serotonin depletion because the serotonin is not getting taken up back into the cells.
It's like the damage the drugs do put us under a spell, which makes it difficult and sometimes impossible for us to know what's happening to us. And then we'll attribute it to something else. So we'll be angry, we'll get mad at our wives instead of saying the drug is making me irritable. Or we'll get depressed and suicidal instead of being able to recognize the drug is doing it. And in some cases, much less common, people actually totally lose their inhibitions and become violent.
In fact, LSD is very similar to serotonin. Same class, basically the same substance. Basically, it's the same molecule. And if you want to know what the effects of too much serotonin are, the kind of effects that you get when you start to manipulate the serotonin clearing system, which is how these SSRI drugs are, think of the last time you saw somebody on some kind of LSD trip. LSD was actually researched, was discovered when they were researching ways to manipulate this serotonin system.
GSK engaged in an illegal marketing campaign where drugs were promoted for disorders where there was no medical evidence they would help. Allegations of promoting the drug Paxil for treating depression in patients under 18, even though the FDA has never approved it for kids. This was done despite the fact the company had evidence the drug could spark suicidal thoughts in young people.
They even tolerate huge fines against them, which is also the case. They were busted for off-label marketing this Zyprexa, which means they illegally marketed this antipsychotic to people, to doctors to use for kids who weren't psychotic, to use for old people who are disruptive in old age homes. You're not allowed to do that. It's illegal. It's off-label marketing. But so they get fined $1 billion. Well, that's about what they make in a quarter, 1 quarter for Zyprexa. So it's all about these drug companies are smart enough to spend a few bucks here to make tons of money elsewhere.
Tell your doctor right away if your depression worsens, you have unusual changes in behavior, or thoughts of suicide. Antidepressants can increase these in children, teens, and young adults. Severe liver problems, some fatal, were reported. Signs include abdominal pain and yellowing of the skin or eyes. Talk with your doctor about your medicines, including those for migraine, or if you have high fever, confusion, and stiff muscles, to address a possible life-threatening condition.
And they're very clever. They realize that they could spend 75% of that commercial listing side effects, horrific side effects, if you actually listen to the commercials and don't mute them, which a lot of us do, including myself nowadays. I get so sick of hearing them. But it doesn't matter because the visuals of seeing a person who's upset and hurting and all of a sudden taking a pill and then the happy music and the happy smile, those are powerful manipulative forces.
The drugs that we now consider antidepressants were discovered by accident. They were drugs that were used for the treatment of tuberculosis, and somebody noticed that some tubercular patients felt better when they took the drugs, and they said, oh, maybe this is an antidepressant. But they decided that without doing clinical trials that were placebo-controlled, and it turned out that placebos will do the exact same thing.
And the scary thing about antidepressants is that we've known for a long time, and now this is finally being revealed in the mainstream press. It's actually 60 Minutes did a big story on this, is that we know Prozac compared to placebo really doesn't work very well.
1 in 10 people get treated for depression with antidepressant drugs. The problem is only 10% of those people are getting a true drug benefit from taking those medications. The rest of them are experiencing a placebo effect and could experience the same benefit without the drug at all.
We would be better off if doctors could still give placebo, sugar pills. There's very little scientifically in terms of positive effects, and there's horrible adverse effects. So in terms of a drug having been approved, these drugs should never have been approved when you consider how horrible the adverse effects are and how little any kind of beneficial effects.
So the question is, if antidepressants are not much better than placebo, why are they used so much? Why do doctors prescribe it? And the answer is the doctors had no way of knowing how small the difference was between drug and placebos because the drug companies hid the data. Almost half of the studies that were done by the drug companies have been buried. They have not been sent to journals for publication.
The chemical imbalance theory of depression, the idea that depression is caused by a lack of serotonin and that you build your serotonin, you're not depressed. Number one, it's simplistic and naive, and number two, it's never been shown to be the case. In fact, drugs that block serotonin have been shown to have antidepressant activity just as well as drugs that increase serotonin.
If you call up a researcher from Eli Lilly, and let's say you're a journalist and do this, they will start out with that story. They'll say, oh, well, it's like insulin for diabetes, it corrects an imbalance. And you'll say, well, no, it doesn't. It blocks, you've done your research of what's sent to the FDA, and you'll say, no, it blocks these neurotransmitters profoundly. That's not balancing anything. And they say, oh, well, that's true. So the guys at Eli Lilly will back away from that in 2 seconds.
Please do not be fooled by the simplistic idea that all you do is raise your serotonin levels and you're not depressed anymore. That is drug company propaganda. That is marketing and advertising information that has never been shown to be the case.
I asked a guy from Janssen, which makes risperidone, why do you make these statements? It's like insulin for diabetes. He says, well, it gets people to take their drugs. It's a story that they can understand. And I said, so it's not real? They said, no, of course not. We know it's much more complicated, etc.
What has been shown to be the case is that elevations in serotonin, super high levels of serotonin, such as the kind that are caused by artificially manipulating the serotonin system, are associated with agitation, with restlessness, with diarrhea, with hallucinations, with fast heartbeat. Serotonin itself, the very word serotonin, means sero for blood, tonin for tightening. That's because serotonin's classic effect is blood clotting and hypertension.
I know many people, as you do, who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia and indeed descended deep into psychotic breaks, who have recovered and are off their medications. So personal experience tells you that it's possible and that it can happen. But second of all, and this is what we don't know about and we forget about, if you look at the research literature, that recovery was even sort of common. And I mean off medication recovery was quite common before we ended up with this paradigm of care telling people they had to be on drugs for life and they had no hope of ever recovering. Do you think young psychiatrists are being told, you know, we followed schizophrenia patients up for 30 years and we found that, believe it or not, we don't have to be so despairing. A third completely recover. Now they all happen to be off their drugs, so what we should do is help them get off their drugs.
Right, of course.
Is that told to psychiatric residents today? Not a chance.
No, these aren't entertainers.
Y'all ready for this?
They're senior executives with pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline at a pep rally in Las Vegas for their sales team.
Who wants to be a millionaire?
The goal, to rev up sales as part of what prosecutors say was a culture of greed, where patient safety took a backseat to profit.
You do the math. There are people in this room who are going to make an ungodly sum of money.